She wasn't supposed to be the one on the train. Lucinda May Jenkins sat with her gloved hands folded over a worn velvet bag, the one that had belonged to her grandmother. The train shuddered across plains she'd never seen before. Wind battered the windows like it was trying to get in and ask why she had come. She didn't look like the kind of girl who would chase a new life. She wasn't flashy, wasn't bold. Her sister, Margaret, had always been the one with a charming laugh, the quick wit, the beauty that turned heads. Lucinda was the second daughter, soft-spoken, watchful, always stitching something with quiet purpose. But Margaret had changed her mind. On the morning she was meant to board the train west, she eloped with a city banker in a blue suit. Left a note. No apology. Just, "You'll understand one day." And Lucinda, after staring at that empty doorway for too long, packed the bag, the letter, and all the courage she'd never expected to use. She'd sent a telegram. Brief. Honest. "My sister cannot come. I will arrive in her place. If this is unwelcome, I understand." No reply came. Still, she boarded. The train smelled of coal smoke and worn coats. An older woman across the aisle watched Lucinda as if she might unravel. "Going to meet your husband?" the woman asked kindly. Lucinda smiled, small and strained. "Something like that." She watched towns flicker past. Wooden buildings, frost on the rooftops, faces she didn't know and would never meet. She imagined the man, the rancher, Elijah Blackwood, a name with weight, a man of land, of hard hands, and maybe, if she dared hope, a kind heart. She had no photograph, only the description Margaret once shared. Tall, serious, said he wanted a practical wife, not a pretty one. Lucinda wasn't sure if that was meant to be comforting. When the train screeched into Whistler's Gulch, the sky was a clean sheet of pale blue. Snow clung to the ground in patches like forgotten lace. Lucinda stepped down in her best dress, sage green wool, hem stitched with care, and looked around. He was there. Elijah. She recognized him instantly, not from a face she'd seen, but by the way he stood, arms crossed, jaw tight, as if the whole town leaned against him. He scanned the passengers. His eyes passed over her, then doubled back, and narrowed. Lucinda stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood, you're not Margaret." His voice landed like an axe. No greeting, no question. She swallowed. "No, sir. She couldn't come. I wrote. I asked for Margaret." His boots crunched as he stepped back. "Not her sister. This ain't what I agreed to." People turned. Eyes prickled at her spine. Someone whispered, "That her? The wrong bride." "I understand," Lucinda said, though her voice didn't feel like hers. "You don't owe me anything. I'll find a place to stay." But the platform had already decided. The rancher turned and walked away, and the town followed suit, eyes lingering too long before pretending they hadn't looked at all. The boarding house on Ash Street had one open room. Small, slanted ceiling. A single bed with a quilt that smelled of dust and old lemons. Lucinda didn't cry that first night. She unpacked slowly, laying the embroidered linens, meant for a wedding bed, into the drawer. Folded, smoothed, tucked away like memories no one else wanted. She stared at the wall until dawn. Days passed. She walked the streets with her chin high but shoulders hunched. Women nodded but never stopped. Men looked, then didn't. At the market, she offered her coin for apples. The grocer hesitated just a second too long before handing them over. She learned the whispers quickly. She tricked him. Poor Elijah. Who does that? Comes in someone else's place. But Lucinda didn't defend herself. Words had never been her shield. She let silence answer. Let her hands do the talking, baking bread, mending gloves, cleaning the church steps when no one else did. She met the pastor's wife at Sunday service. "You're the sister," the woman said, not cruelly, but not kindly either. "Yes, ma'am." That was all. But that night, Lucinda left a loaf of sweetbread on the parsonage steps, still warm. Letters came from home, but she didn't open them. Not yet. Not while the ache was still fresh. She busied herself. Sewed quilts for the church fundraiser. Fixed a child's torn mitten without being asked. But when she walked past Elijah's ranch, sprawling, fenced, quiet, Her hands would curl into her coat. She wondered if he still thought of her as a trespasser. She wondered if she had become one. One afternoon, she found a patch of wild sage behind the boarding house. She knelt in the cold dirt and began planting roots from the dry bundles she'd brought in her satchel. Herbs for healing. Not because she was needed, but because the earth, at least, didn't question her presence. As she worked, someone cleared their throat behind her. She turned. A child, maybe 10, stood with wide eyes and dirty boots. "You're the lady with the pies," he said. "I've made a few," Lucinda replied. "My ma says you're strange, but your crust's better than hers." Lucinda smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it felt real. She gave him a slice wrapped in paper. He ran off laughing. That night, she baked 2 more pies. One she kept. The other she left by the town well, where someone who needed it might find it. Winter rolled in slowly. The kind that didn't roar, just crept under doors and into the bones. Lucinda lit candles with trembling hands, stitched another row into the quilt meant for a marriage that never came. She dreamed, sometimes, of the train again. Only now, when it arrived, no one was there. She stepped down alone, over and over. Then came the afternoon of the snowstorm. She had gone out to collect kindling, but slipped on ice near the alley behind the general store. Boots stopped beside her. "Miss Jenkins." She looked up. Elijah. He offered no hand, just looked at her like someone studying a problem that wouldn't solve. "You all right?" "I will be." A beat. "Then, I didn't mean to shame you." Lucinda stood, brushed her skirt. "You were honest." The rest followed their own will. He nodded. Another beat. Then he turned and left again. She watched his back disappear down the street and wondered which was heavier, being rejected or being remembered only as a mistake. That night, as wind howled against her shutters, she wrote a letter. Not to Elijah, not to her sister, to herself. "You are not a substitute. You are not an accident. You came because no one else would, and that matters more than they know." She folded it, tucked it beneath her pillow, slept soundly for the first time in months. And in the morning, she lit the stove, baked bread, mended 3 coats. Then she stepped into the town square, her shawl pinned with a brooch she hadn't worn before. She didn't walk like someone hoping to be seen. She walked like someone who'd already found something worth holding, even if the world hadn't noticed it yet. The stove ran cold some mornings. Lucinda would sit at the edge of the bed, fingers stiff, watching her breath cloud in the pale light that crept through cracked windows. The boarding house had its own kind of silence, not comforting, not cruel, just indifferent. The land outside offered no welcome. The snow had turned to brittle crusts of ice. Wind pushed against doors like it wanted to remind her she didn't belong. She rose anyway, every morning. First the bread, then the mending, then the hours spent with her hands. Occupied, because hands that worked left no room for the mind to spiral down old regrets. No one came knocking. No one said her name out loud in church. But they spoke of her. In shop corners, at water pumps, between hymns. She's the one who came uninvited, supposed to be the sister, the pretty one. He didn't even take her coat. Their words didn't wound, not exactly. They echoed, like a draft she couldn't find the source of, slipping in through cracks and making the whole place feel colder. Still, she showed up. She brought pie to the widow Mathers, who had broken her hip, left a jar of salve on the step of the blacksmith's wife, who'd burned her hand. She repaired 2 quilts for the pastor's newborn niece and refused payment both times. No one thanked her in public. But when the parson's wife next saw her in the general store, she gave a tight nod. Just once. It was a beginning. At night, Lucinda boiled water with dried lavender, pressed warm cloths to her aching feet, and told herself, "You did enough today. You don't need to be adored." A month passed. Whispers persisted, but softened. Her presence, once a scandal, became a curiosity. People still looked, but not always with disdain. Sometimes with hesitation. Sometimes, rarely, with a flicker of something like respect. It changed the morning she stood outside in the wind, arms cradling a basket of unsold bread. A dog barked. Horses shifted near the hitching post. Lucinda turned to go home and nearly bumped into him. Daniel Reed. She'd seen him before. Silent man, maybe 30, always near Elijah's ranch. Wore sorrow like a second skin, but not in the way that demanded attention. His eyes held stories no one dared ask about. "Miss Jenkins," he said. She blinked. "Yes. I hear you so. I do." He held up a shirt, torn at the shoulder, threadbare at the collar. "It was my brother's." Lucinda took it gently. "I'll treat it kindly." He nodded once, walked away. No more words. She took her time mending the cloth, washed it, pressed it, strengthened the collar with her smallest stitch. 3 days later, she found a jar of honey on her porch. No note. She started to notice the small things. A woman who used to look through her now held the door one morning. The baker, once stony-faced, offered a bruised apple with her purchase and muttered, "Extra." Children stopped staring. One waved. Lucinda didn't mistake it for acceptance. But it wasn't rejection either. It was space. And space was something she could grow within. She planted mint in the frost-bitten soil behind the boarding house, wrapped her fingers in cloth to keep them warm while she dug. Daniel passed by once with his horse. He slowed, said nothing, but tipped his hat. She nodded back. And when she left 2 biscuits wrapped in a napkin on his fence post the next morning, he didn't mention it. But the napkin came back, folded, cleaned, and pressed. 3 days later, some nights she heard music from town dances, laughter drifting through the street like perfume she couldn't afford to wear. She didn't go, not because she wasn't invited, but because it didn't call to her yet. Instead, she lit her oil lamp and read the one book she owned. Poetry by candlelight, the flicker catching the gold edges of the pages. Then one day, another book appeared on her porch. Wuthering Heights. No name, just a leaf tucked inside. She smiled and pressed her palm to the cover. Rain came suddenly that week. Thunder without warning. She stood on her porch, holding the quilt she'd spent weeks mending, and cursed herself for not checking the sky. Daniel appeared from nowhere. "You'll catch cold." She opened her mouth to reply, but he took the quilt from her arms, draped it over his own shoulder, and said, "I'll help." They ran to the shed behind the church, water pelting their backs, laughing. Or maybe it was just breath catching in their throats that sounded like laughter. Inside the dry dark, they stood still. "I used to think you were fragile," he said. Lucinda looked up at him. "You're not." She didn't know what to say, so she said thank you. He nodded. "Not sure anyone's told you that yet." "No one has." He left soon after, but not before hanging the quilt to dry with care. Weeks passed. She learned his schedule. He brought her broken things. Boots with worn soles. Buttons missing from sleeves. Always handed over quietly, as if asking for help was a private language only she knew how to read. And once, he brought her a handkerchief, old and fraying. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "I'll mend it carefully." "I know." Their hands brushed. Just once. The next day, she left bread on his porch. This time, she added a note. "The crust might be hard, but the heart is soft." He never spoke of it, but every time he saw her after that, he smiled. Just barely. Just enough. One morning, the town awoke to find the blacksmith's shop ablaze. Lucinda joined the bucket line, without hesitation. Skirt soaked, arms aching. She passed water hand to hand, didn't stop even when her fingers turned raw. Later, as smoke curled into the sky, the blacksmith's wife embraced her, cried into her shoulder. No one whispered about Lucinda that day. They just said she helped. The next Sunday, someone saved her a seat in the pew. Spring whispered in early. The herbs sprouted faster. Bees returned. A child placed a daisy in Lucinda's braid during a market morning. When she looked across the street, Daniel was watching. He didn't look away. One afternoon, he knocked on her door, held up a small wooden box. "Found this in the attic," he said. "Didn't know what to do with it, but it feels like something you'd make bloom." She opened it. Inside, packets of seeds. Basil, thyme, lavender, marigold. "They'll need light," he added, rubbing the back of his neck. "I have a window," she said. He nodded. Then, softly, and I'll be around if you need help with the soil." She smiled. "I'll need it." That night, she stitched a new shawl. Pale blue, lined with soft red, tiny flowers embroidered near the collar. She wore it to the general store. Didn't explain it to anyone. Just wore it like a flag she no longer had to wave. People nodded. Some smiled. And when she left, someone called after her. Lucinda. Just that. Her name. Not her sister's. Not the girl who came instead. Just Lucinda. She returned home to find a new book on her doorstep. This one wrapped in cloth. No note. But she didn't need one. She sat at her window, watching dusk fall. Smoke curled from the town's chimneys. Children's laughter echoed down the hill. Lucinda held the handkerchief she'd stitched, Daniel's mother's, and traced the seams with her finger. Her life wasn't loud. It didn't come with applause or grand rescues. But it had shape now, and soil, and someone planting beside her. Even if the town never fully welcomed her, she had begun to welcome herself. That, too, was survival. The flowers came up first. Little pockets of green where there had only been brittle frost before. Lucinda brushed soil from her skirt and watched the mint push its way through the dirt, defiant in its softness. Life had returned. Not loud, not bursting, just steady. Like Daniel. He didn't come every day. Sometimes a week would pass with nothing more than a quiet glance across the road or a faint knock on the porch rail when she wasn't home. But when he did appear, he brought things that mattered. A spool of thread he'd found in an old drawer. A tattered book on wild herbs. A chipped teacup. Small offerings, as if he were slowly furnishing a space between them. He never asked for anything, except once. She found him on her porch one morning, holding a tin box. "Need help building a window shelf," he said. "For the herbs." She blinked. "You do that?" He looked down, rubbing his thumb along the box's rusted edge. Figured it might be nice to see something growing again. Lucinda stepped aside. "Come in." He smelled of cedar and smoke. Not harsh, just warm. While he measured the window frame and marked wood with quiet precision, Lucinda stitched a tea towel. The silence between them didn't stretch, it settled. Like two people sitting at the edge of a familiar river, listening without needing to speak. "You read this?" he asked, tapping the poetry book on her table. "Every night." He nodded once. "It's got a sadness to it, but not the kind that breaks you. More like it knows." She looked up. "I think the writer must have been lonely once." "Aren't we all?" he said, soft as dust. The shelf was finished by afternoon. Daniel dusted off his hands, took a step back. She lined it with little clay pots, basil, mint, sage, and lavender, and set the teacup in the middle like a crown. "I haven't said thank you," she murmured. "You don't have to." "I want to." He didn't smile, but something behind his eyes warmed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single wrapped sweet. "Saw these at the mercantile. Thought of you." Lucinda took it with both hands, held it like it was delicate. "I haven't had one since I was a girl," she whispered. "Then you were overdue." She found herself humming more, while sewing, while walking, while sweeping the porch. Not songs she knew, just soft melodies that had waited to be born. He came back, sometimes just to leave something at her door. A spool, a feather, a smooth stone. Other times, to sit. They shared warm bread in the cool air, sat side by side while the wind tickled the curtains. They read aloud once, when the rain was too loud to think. He had a slow voice, careful, like the words had weight, and he meant every one. She liked the way he said hope, as if it wasn't a fragile thing. One day, she showed him her letters. Not the ones she sent, the ones she never mailed. "I write them when the words won't stay quiet," she said. He didn't read them, just held the bundle gently and said, "That's how I talk to my wife. Not with letters, just in my mind." "What do you say?" "That I still see her in sunlight. That I don't feel guilty anymore." Lucinda's breath caught. "You shouldn't." "I don't," he said. "Not since you started growing things." She baked a peach pie that week. Crust golden, edges soft. Left it on his windowsill. With it, a note. For the man who brought spring early. He didn't reply. But the next morning, She found a carved hairpin on her porch. Oakwood, smooth, delicate, shaped like a branch with tiny etched leaves. No name, no note, just something beautiful, left in plain sight. She wore it to church that Sunday. When she stepped into the aisle, heads turned. Not with shock, not with gossip, with pause. Even the pastor's wife blinked twice. Daniel sat in the back pew. When she passed him, he stood, gave her his seat, then walked her home after service. They didn't speak much, just walked. But at her gate, he said, "That pin suits you." She smiled. "So does that silence." He chuckled, just once, then added, "I've grown fond of it." Spring poured in faster than expected. The trees dressed themselves in green. The town grew louder, lighter. Children ran barefoot through puddles. Birds stitched songs into morning. But between Lucinda and Daniel, the quiet remained. Not as emptiness, as understanding. She began saving a second cup of tea on her table each evening, just in case. Some nights he came. Other nights he didn't. But the cup stayed warm for a little while either way. He brought her a book of folk remedies once. "Figured you'd know more than the author," he said. "Not yet. You will." They sat on her steps, the stars above sharp and clear. Daniel pointed to one. My ma used to say that star was the guardian," he said. "Watched over folks who didn't ask for much." Lucinda tilted her head. "Do you believe that?" "I believe in people who keep going." She turned to him. "And do you?" He looked at her, full and steady. "I do now." The next day he didn't come, nor the day after. She waited, left a napkin on the railing, lit the lamp early, in case he saw it from the road. He didn't. The third day, she went to his cabin, knocked. No answer. She left a loaf of bread on his step, with a note. "I miss your silences." That evening, she found a pine cone wrapped in cloth on her porch. Inside was a note in his scrawled hand. "Me too. Just needed to be quiet with myself. I'll come soon." She tucked it into her drawer like a treasure. He returned on the fifth day. Didn't say much, but he brought a pot of wildflowers. Said they looked lonely. She placed them on the shelf he built, right in the center. She didn't think of it as love. Not at first. It didn't arrive with thunder. No grand words or sweeping touches. It came in spoonfuls of honey, in pages turned aloud, in the way he looked at her as if she were made of something rare and steady. One morning, as they shared breakfast, he reached for her hand. Not urgently, not with hunger, just presence. And she let him hold it. He came more often after that, but still not every day. And she never asked why. She understood now. Some people love with presence, others with absence. Daniel did both. One afternoon, she fell ill. Fever, chills, weakness in her bones. She meant to keep it to herself. But he came anyway. Knocked. Found her curled on the floor near the stove, trying to light the fire. He didn't speak. Just lifted her gently, wrapped her in the quilt she'd stitched, and sat beside her while the kettle boiled. She drifted in and out. He stayed. At one point, she woke to find her head on his lap, his hand on her hair, and the room glowing with candlelight. He was humming. A low tune. Something mournful, but not without light. She recovered. Slowly. He never spoke of it again. Neither did she. But something shifted. The silence between them was no longer cautious. It was sacred. One night, she told him about the platform. About the way Elijah had looked at her. The way the townspeople had stared. How small she had felt. Daniel said nothing at first. Then leaned forward, took her face in his hands, and said, "He never saw you." That was his mistake. "I do." She closed her eyes and let herself be seen. She didn't need a proposal. She didn't need a vow. But when he left that night, he kissed her brow and whispered, "You're the only choice I've made in years that felt like peace." And that was enough. The town had a rhythm. Come summer, the square filled with the smell of dust, baked bread, and wagon oil. Children darted like swallows between barrels. Music drifted from porches. Sundays were slower, softer. But the harvest dance was always loud. This year it was earlier. The rains had come kind. Crops had grown wild. And Lucinda was asked, not suggested, not whispered about, but asked to bake pies for the table. 3 would do, the pastor's wife said, setting a linen down beside her. Lucinda simply nodded. She made 5. 1 apple, 2 peach, 1 blackberry, and 1 that didn't have a name, honey, cinnamon, and a touch of lavender, stitched into the crust with quiet care. She set them on the table beneath the church's white awning and didn't wait for thanks. People gave it anyway. "Miss Jenkins, your peach is a sin and a blessing," one man said with his mouth full. A girl tugged on her skirt. "Ma says you make the town smell better." Even Mrs. Dalton, who once wouldn't share hymn books, said, "You've got away with pastry." Lucinda just smiled and adjusted the shawl at her shoulder. The pale blue one, now stitched with little vines at the hem. She'd added those after Daniel started staying through the night. Not always inside, but always nearby. Sometimes just asleep on the porch chair with a blanket she laid over him after he thought she'd gone to bed. When she turned from the table, Daniel was there. He didn't speak. He held out his hand. She took it. They danced, not with flourish, not to be watched. Just steady, measured. His hands were firm, hers soft, and they turned beneath the flickering lanterns like the world had slowed to let them finish a thought. The townsfolk watched. They didn't whisper. Someone began to clap. Daniel leaned close, voice low against her temple. "They see you now." Lucinda smiled. "I've seen myself for a while." He paused, then stepped back and did something no one expected. He dropped to one knee. Lucinda blinked. The fiddle stopped. He didn't hold a ring, didn't make a speech. He simply said, "I'd walk with you if you'd let me. I don't need to own a thing. I just want to walk beside it." Her voice caught, not because it was sudden, but because it wasn't. "Yes," she said, not for them, not for the crowd, just for him. He stood, took her hand again. They danced once more, and this time others joined. Children spun in crooked circles. Old couples waltzed like they remembered how to be young. The air felt sweeter than pie, brighter than stars. Lucinda saw Elijah across the square. He wasn't alone. A woman with russet hair stood beside him. He raised his glass in her direction. She raised her chin and gave a small nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not anger. It was peace. By night's end, the pies were gone. But the lavender crust one? Someone had saved a slice. Left it on her porch in a clean tin. No name. Just a flower tucked beneath the lid. Daniel placed it in the cupboard. "Legend," he said, "starts in small slices." The next morning, they planted marigolds outside the boarding house. Bright, fierce, golden. "Why these?" she asked. "They repel the pests," he said, "and they last long into the frost." She pressed her hand into the dirt beside his. "Like people," she said. He kissed her wrist, not rushed, not watched. Just because. Lucinda didn't leave town. She moved 2 streets over, to a cabin with ivy creeping up the side and a rocking chair with a view of sunrise. She didn't take every stitch with her. Left a quilt with the widow Mathers, a stack of books with the children at the church, a jar of honey on the pastor's steps. The shawl came with her. So did Daniel. Not as a rescuer, not as a prize, but as someone who knew how to see her without blinking. And in a place where she was once dismissed, once passed over, Lucinda May Jenkins became something else. Not the girl who came in her sister's place. Not the rejected bride. Just Lucinda, the woman who planted lavender in frost, who stitched her name into the town one pie, one thread, one act of kindness at a time. So if the world ever hands you someone else's name or leaves you standing alone on a platform, remember Lucinda May Jenkins. She wasn't chosen first, but she chose herself. She wasn't invited, but she stayed anyway. Because some stories aren't loud. Some healings don't come with rescue. Sometimes the quiet ones bloom last, but bloom longest. And sometimes being seen isn't about standing in a spotlight. It's about walking into the square, head high, shawl on your shoulders, and knowing the worth you carry in your bones, even if no one claps. Not at first, but oh, they will, when the right eyes finally see you. The letter had been folded so many times its creases had softened like cloth. Clara May Jenkins kept it pressed between her fingers, even as the train rocked hard across a ridge. The ink had faded a little, but she'd memorized every line. A man named Thomas Reed, 41, no children, widowed, had written kindly, with neat loops and respectful phrases. He'd said she sounded like the kind of woman who made a house a home. He'd even written that a limp didn't scare him, that he wanted character, not perfection. She'd read that part 3 times a night for a month. Now, hours from arriving, she stared out the window at the hills stitched with fences and trees, her thoughts louder than the tracks. She wore her best dress, gray wool modest buttons, hemmed just long enough to cover her left boot, which was built a half-inch taller than the right. Her cane rested against her leg, carved from hickory and sanded smooth by her own hands. The handle had a small dent from where her father's belt had once struck it in a fit of frustration. She'd kept that dent, like she kept everything, quietly, stubbornly, without fuss. The train slowed. Steam hissed. The sky was pale gold, just past dawn, and the station came into view like a breath held too long. She stepped off carefully, suitcase in one hand, cane in the other. No one rushed to meet her. No name on a placard, no smile in the crowd. Just a few townsfolk gathering parcels, a boy dragging a wooden crate, a woman selling bread from a basket that steamed in the cold. Then she saw him, Thomas Reed, tall and broad, with a gray coat and a hat pulled low. He looked just like his photograph, only older, more tired around the eyes. He stood still, arms crossed, and watched her make her way down the platform. She smiled, small but certain. She limped slowly, steadily. The distance between them shrank. When she was just a few steps away, he didn't speak. His gaze dropped, scanning from her eyes to her cane, then to her left foot, where her boot was scuffed from dragging slightly in the snow. "I thought," he muttered. Clara's grip tightened on her suitcase. "I thought you said it wasn't bad." She blinked. "I said I walked with a limp. I didn't lie." Thomas looked past her. "I thought it'd be more manageable." Discreet. A pause. Cold wind threaded between them. "You came all this way," he said, almost to himself. "But I need someone who can help with the land, not someone I'll have to carry. I didn't ask to be carried. Well, I won't be cruel about it. But this won't work." And just like that, he tipped his hat, turned, and walked away. The steam from the train hissed again, this time louder, as if mocking her silence. She stood there, still. Her suitcase sagged against her knee. The letter, warm in her glove, now felt like it belonged to a stranger. A woman to her right gasped softly, whispering to her companion. A man nudged his son and shook his head. Clara didn't cry. She simply turned away from where Thomas had vanished and limped toward the edge of the platform. The cold wood beneath her boots creaked. Each step felt heavier. She didn't know where to go. She didn't know who to ask. Her instructions had been to meet Thomas and ride back to his ranch. That was it. Her money had bought the train ticket and the dress. All that remained now was a bruised pride, a half-full coin purse, and the ache in her hip that always got worse in winter. She found a bench under the station eave and sat down slowly. Snowflakes began to drift, fat and slow. Her breath came out in little clouds. By mid-morning, the townsfolk had mostly gone. The train left again, leaving silence in its place. A dog barked somewhere. Bells chimed faintly from a church tower. Clara remained, still holding the letter. A woman approached her at midday, wore a thick shawl, and smelled like soup and flour. "You waiting on someone?" Clara hesitated. "Not anymore." The woman's brow furrowed. "You're the mail-order girl?" Clara nodded, ashamed of the label, though it was true. "Well, that fool didn't deserve you then." The woman glanced down at the cane. "You got a place to stay?" "No." "You bake." "I can." "Then come with me. I've got a spare cot in the shed and a sweet tooth that needs tending." Clara didn't move at first, didn't quite know how to thank someone when pride was all she had left. But the woman's face was kind, so she nodded once, stood, and followed her through the snow. They passed by a store. Inside, a boy stared out through the frosted glass and whispered to his mother, That's the woman who got left at the station." The words hit like stones to her chest, but Clara kept walking. At the edge of town, the shed was small but clean. A cot with a quilt, a wash basin, and hooks for her coat. The woman, Mrs. Tally, left her alone and said she'd return for supper. That night, Clara washed her face, changed into her nightgown, and laid the letter flat on her chest as she stared at the ceiling. She didn't cry, but something inside her cracked just wide enough for cold to seep in. Over the next few days, she swept the woman's porch, helped peel apples, stitched a neighbor's apron, and stayed mostly silent. The town began to buzz, softly, curiously, cruelly. They watched her limp from shop to shop with her chin held high, and when she passed, they lowered their voices, but not their eyes. She came all that way and got left. Reckless thing, thinking someone'd take her like that. "I heard she's got something wrong inside, not just a leg." Clara said nothing, not to them. But at night, she whispered to herself, "I am not what they see. I am what I survived." Each day, she earned a coin or two. Enough for flour, enough for dignity. And then one evening, while returning from the dressmaker's with mended thread in her pocket, she nearly stumbled into a tall man carrying a broken saddle strap. He steadied her with one hand, let go the moment she was balanced. "Beg your pardon," he said, voice deep and quiet. She nodded. "You sew?" "I do." He handed her the leather. "This tore last week. Couldn't fix it myself. Miss Tally said you had steady hands." Clara took it gently. "I'll do my best. Don't rush. I'm not in a hurry." He started to turn, then paused. "I'm Elias Ward. Live just north of the ridge." She gave her name, but didn't offer more. He tipped his hat and walked away. She watched him go. His boots didn't crunch too loud in the snow. His shoulders were straight, but not stiff. And for the first time in many days, no one looked at her with pity. He'd simply seen her. And that had been enough. She held the strap close to her chest and felt something strange. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the faintest stirring of worth. The wind that swept through the town had a habit of finding cracks in windows, doors, and the skin of anyone who dared to walk alone. Clara made Jenkins move through it without flinching. Her cane struck the dirt rhythmically, like a clock counting time backward. Most days, she carried a small basket lined with a cloth she embroidered herself. Inside were loaves of bread, yeast-scented, brown just so, with crusts that cracked beneath a spoonful of butter. She didn't charge much. Some gave coins. Others, a bundle of herbs, a spool of thread, a few apples. She took it all with grace, never asking for more. They called her the rejected bride. Not to her face, of course, but she saw it in the sideways glances, the pregnant pauses in conversations, the way children whispered behind coat sleeves. She lived in the shed behind Mrs. Tally's home, a little lean-to with a crooked door and a quilt hung as a curtain. The woman let her stay for chores and kindness, not out of pity. They didn't talk much, but they shared a rhythm. Mornings were for kneading dough, middays for stitching or scrubbing, evenings for soup and soft silence. Every town had its rhythm. Clara had learned to move quietly within it, not seeking attention, just enough space to exist. One morning, the widow down the road, Mrs. Kettle, stood on her porch shouting about a ripped hem and aching bones. Clara went to her, without being asked, needle and thread in her apron. She stitched the tear, fetched firewood, and didn't linger long enough for thanks. She wasn't trying to earn favor. She was trying to matter, however quietly. That afternoon, a boy named Aaron, no more than 8, tripped outside the general store and bloodied his knee. Clara tore a strip from her own petticoat and bound the cut. His mother blinked twice, then pulled him away without a word. But that evening, a jar of peach preserves was left at Clara's door. Word spread slower than gossip, but faster than truth. The crippled girl was helpful, polite, didn't beg, kept her eyes down, her hands busy. Still, she remained to whisper, until the day Elias Ward came back. He didn't knock, just stood outside the shed, holding a bundle wrapped in canvas. "Shirt tore clean across," he said. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You can fix it." "I can." He hesitated. "And if I can't pay today?" I don't ask ahead. He gave a short nod. You don't talk much. Not unless there's something worth saying. That earned a faint smile. She worked on his shirt that evening, by lantern light, her needle steady despite the ache in her hand. The fabric was worn but strong, like the man who'd worn it. She didn't know much about Elias. Only what Mrs. Tally muttered between bites of stew, that he'd buried a wife young, never remarried, kept to himself on a ranch full of cattle and silence. When he came to retrieve the shirt, he brought a book. Not payment, he clarified. Just something to borrow. Thought you might like it. It was leaves of grass, spine cracked, edges yellowed. She held it like it might sing. I used to read by firelight, he said. But these days I just watch the fire. That night, Clara read aloud to herself, mouthing the words in the dark. Whitman wrote of the self, the body, the soul. She didn't fully understand it, but she understood enough to know that someone, somewhere, had also walked differently and still found beauty in it. Days passed, then weeks. He came again. A glove to mend, a belt to reinforce. She never asked why a man who lived alone had so many things to fix. Sometimes he sat on the stoop while she worked. They talked, softly, sparsely, not about the past, but about bread recipes, the weather, books. One day he asked if she missed home. She said, I never had one. Their silence after that wasn't awkward. It was shared. One morning, Clara woke early to start dough. The sky was the color of faded bluebells, the air cold enough to nip at her nose. She was rolling the loaves when she heard a knock at the front door. Mrs. Tally answered. Clara kept kneading. Moments later, the widow stepped into the kitchen with a look she didn't wear often. Something between surprise and approval. That Ward fellow just left this, she said, holding up a bundle. Inside was a tin of tea leaves, a soft scarf, and a note. For mornings colder than your hands can bear. Clara touched the fabric, fingers trembling just once before she steadied them. That afternoon, she carried loaves into town as usual. The scarf lay across her shoulders, cinnamon brown and warm as a hug. At the bakery, a woman she didn't know asked where she got it. Clara said softly, it was a gift. And for the first time, the woman didn't look at her with pity, just curiosity. She passed Elias that evening near the livery. He didn't speak, but he nodded. She nodded back. That was enough. It was always enough. Weeks later, while mending a saddle strap, Clara paused to ease her leg. The pain had worsened in the cold. She pressed her palm against her thigh until the ache dulled. She didn't hear the footstep until a shadow crossed the door. Hurting? Elias asked. Some days more than others. He stepped closer, gently. You ever rest? Resting makes me feel useless. You're not useless, Clara May Jenkins. He said it like he was reciting scripture. She looked up then, fully. That's the first time you said my name. I know. The silence stretched, long and full of meaning. Then he added, I don't mind the limp. She held his gaze. Good, because I'm not hiding it. He smiled then, real and full. Didn't think you would. That night, she sat on the porch and watched the stars blink awake. She ran a thumb over the worn corner of leaves of grass, the words echoing softly in her mind. I exist as I am, that is enough. In the stillness, something began to shift. She had been the girl who was left. Now she was the woman who stayed and stitched and baked and listened and mattered. She had come west for a man. But perhaps, in the quiet hours between rejection and recognition, she had found something better. A life. Elias Ward didn't visit often enough to be predictable, but often enough to be felt. He arrived with the sun behind him and the dust soft beneath his boots, always holding something worn, a belt, a shirt, a question he hadn't yet found words for. Clara began to notice the pauses between his sentences, the way he lingered just long enough to let silence speak for them both. She never asked why he came. He never asked if she minded. That, perhaps, was the beginning of something. One morning, he brought a stack of books in a small sack. Not all were poetry. Some were novels, others historical tales. One a children's primer with hand-drawn animals in the margins. He placed them on her work table with the kind of reverence people usually reserve for church. "I thought you might like a change," he said. "I do." They didn't read them together, not right away. But each time he returned, he asked which she'd finished. And Clara, who hadn't spoken this much to any man since she arrived, found herself quoting lines she liked, explaining stories she didn't. "I think I understand this one," she said once, thumbing through a book of parables. "It's about loss, but also about choosing to live in spite of it." Elias had nodded, but his eyes said more. They always did. She began baking an extra roll on Thursdays. Just one, set aside, tucked in cloth. He never asked for it. She never offered it. But when he came, it was there waiting. And he always took it, his hand brushing hers in the exchange. There were no declarations, no stolen glances that burst into passion. But there was warmth, the kind that built slowly, like coals beneath ash, waiting for breath. One evening, as the sky slipped into lavender and gold, Elias arrived with a shirt torn across the shoulder. "Barbed wire," he muttered, holding it out. "You'd think I'd learn." Clara took it from him gently, fingers grazing the edge of the rip. "You don't strike me as careless." He smiled. "No, just human." She began mending by lamplight. He stood by the door, watching, arms folded, eyes scanning the room. It was a small space, just a cot, a basin, a few hooks for clothing, and a crate stacked with books. But it smelled of cinnamon and soap, and the fabric rustled like leaves in quiet wind. "Do you miss the city?" he asked suddenly. Clara paused. "I miss the sound of carriages, sometimes, and the feeling of being invisible." Invisible. In a crowd, no one stares. Elias stepped closer. "I don't stare." She didn't look up. "You don't look away either." Another silence, full, thick, honest. When she finished the stitching, she handed the shirt back, but he didn't take it. He was still watching her, eyes soft, searching. "I notice things," he said. "How your hands never shake when you sew. How you always give the best crust to the widow first. How you say less when you're hurting more." She swallowed. The air between them shifted, not heavier, but truer. "Elias," she said, voice just above a whisper. "Why do you keep coming?" He took the shirt then, folding it slowly. "Because I feel more myself when I'm near you." No one had ever said that to her. Not in words. Not like that. "I'm not much," she said. "You're everything I thought I'd never find again." Her heart beat, so loudly she was afraid he might hear it through the floor. "I walk crooked. I adjust my stride." And that was all. The next week, he didn't come. Nor the week after. She told herself it was ranch work, that the herd needed mending, or the roof did. But still, she waited, kept the extra roll warm, left leaves of grass on the windowsill, open to the page they'd last discussed. The town, meanwhile, was shifting. The whispers softened. Someone asked her to hem a wedding dress. Another offered to buy her bread for the church gathering. One of the children she'd bandaged now waved at her each morning, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Still, she felt his absence like a misstep on a familiar trail. Then, on the 15th day, he returned. His left hand was wrapped in gauze. His coat was soaked from the waist down. "I'm sorry," he said. Fell crossing the creek. Tried to be faster than the mule. Lost that argument. Clara helped him inside, guided him to the chair, unwrapped his hand with care. 2 fingers were bruised, one cut deeply, but clean. "You should have come sooner. I didn't want you to see me weak." She gave him a look that melted the rest of the distance between them. "Then you haven't been paying attention." He smiled, winced, then reached for her hand, not quickly, but deliberately. He held it like it was something sacred. Her fingers rested in his palm, scarred and calloused, yet delicate in how they met his. "I've never danced," she said. "I haven't in years. I'm afraid I'd fall." "Then I'll fall with you." She met his eyes, and in that moment she saw herself fully, not in the way a mirror showed her, but in how he saw her. Not despite the limp, the rejection, the stares, but because of the strength that rose in her anyway. Because of the woman who stitched other people's lives while hers was still healing. He leaned in, pressed his forehead gently to hers. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. In the quiet between them, something had already been promised. The next morning, she rose early and baked 2 loaves instead of 1. And when she stepped outside, scarf wrapped tight, cane steady in her grip, she saw him waiting down the path, not with a gift, not with a torn glove or saddle strap, but with nothing at all. Just himself. And the way he looked at her, like she was the beginning of something good. The town square had been swept clean of dust that morning. Paper ribbons fluttered from fence posts, and pies cooled on every flat surface like offerings to the day. Spring had come late, but it had come boldly. Trees wore new green like pride, and the air was perfumed with lilac and with smoke. They called it the Founders' Day Social, a gathering with fiddle music, bread baskets, and laughter that dared to stretch past grief. There were booths, lemonade, even a wooden dance platform near the well. People came in their Sunday clothes, with polished boots and fresh soap behind their ears. Clara hadn't planned to go. She'd ironed her only dress the day before, then folded it neatly and set it aside. She told herself she'd be tired, that she had bread orders to fill, that her leg ached. But none of those were the truth. The truth was, the dance wasn't meant for her. It was meant for girls with nimble feet and unblemished names, for wives with matching rings and babies on their hips, for the kinds of women men didn't leave behind at train stations. But Mrs. Tally stood in the doorway that morning, hands on her hips, and said, "You're going. I don't belong there. You didn't belong on that bench at the depot, either. And yet, you're still here. So go." Clara held the dress against her chest, pressing her lips together. It was a soft blue, worn at the hem, but clean and carefully stitched. Her limp was worse that day. She took twice as long to braid her hair, hands shaking as she pinned the ends beneath her scarf. She left late, walking slower than she had in weeks. As she approached, she could already hear the music, a jaunty tune layered with boots stomping in time. Children ran past her, trailing laughter. A girl offered her a flower without pausing to ask why she moved so differently. Clara tucked it behind her ear. When she stepped into the square, heads turned, not all, but enough. She felt the old shame try to rise, like a ghost in her chest. But this time, it didn't stick. Maybe it was the music. Maybe it was the way she'd survived. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't need anyone's permission to be seen. She stood near the tables, far from the dance floor, watched as couples spun clumsily, laughed too loudly, and let their burdens fall away with the dust. She'd just reached for a glass of lemonade when she saw him. Elias Ward, standing by the old oak, clean-shaven, his shirt pressed, his eyes already locked on hers. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He walked slowly, as if every step was deliberate, measured not by time, but by intention. And when he reached her, he said nothing at all, just offered his hand. She stared at it. Her fingers tingled. Her heart pounded. "You know I can't dance," she said. "You can lean on me." Her throat tightened. "Everyone's watching. Let them." Still, she hesitated. "It'll be uneven. Then I'll follow your rhythm." His voice was quiet, not demanding, not saving, just offering. She placed her hand in his. They stepped onto the platform. The music slowed, a gentler tune now, something made for stories instead of stomping. People turned to look, some with surprise, some with kindness, a few with the kind of awe reserved for things they didn't understand but couldn't deny. Clara moved cautiously. Her left foot dragged just slightly, but Elias adjusted without missing a beat. He kept his arm firm around her waist, not tight, not guiding, just steady. And in that moment, she realized something. She wasn't just being tolerated. She was being chosen. She looked up into his face and saw nothing but clarity. A man who had seen broken things and learned to love them anyway. A man who didn't need a perfect wife, just a real one. "I never imagined this," she whispered. "I did." Tears gathered behind her eyes, but didn't fall. They danced one full song, then another. When the music ended, people clapped, not just for the tune, but for them. She heard it in the way the sound lingered, not out of pity, but respect. Elias leaned and in front of the whole town, he kissed her, with both hands cradling her face like she was something precious. something whole. The town didn't murmur. It didn't flinch. It simply watched and understood. She stepped off the platform slowly, his hand still holding hers. A girl handed her a slice of pie. A man tipped his hat. And Mrs. Kettle, who once said she'd never trust a woman who came from a city, pressed a parcel into Clara's hands and said, "This is yours now. You earned it." Clara walked home with Elias at her side, the path lit only by the last rays of sun and the music still humming in her bones. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Somewhere along the road, she leaned against him, not out of pain, but out of peace. And he didn't flinch. He simply shifted to carry more of her weight. Morning mist clung to the ridge like a secret. Dew soaked the steps of the porch Elias built plank by plank, his boots still marked with sawdust. Clara stood barefoot, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching a kettle steam on the small stove inside the house they now shared. He had built the porch low, just as she'd once murmured she liked it. Low enough so her feet could graze the earth as she sat and rocked, low enough that she didn't have to climb. They hadn't married in a church. There had been no preacher, no music, no bouquet. Just two chairs, side by side under the big oak tree, and a promise said, without ceremony. "I don't need a vow to keep choosing you," he told her, looking into her eyes like she was made of more than flesh and flaw. And she, in turn, had said, "You are the home I didn't know how to want." Now the days passed in gentle rhythm. She still baked, still stitched. He still worked the land, still smelled of hay and worn leather. But there were differences, small ones. The way he waited for her to step through a door first. The way she left the lamp burning until she heard his boots at night. The way their silences no longer held loneliness, only peace. The town had changed, too. The same people who once whispered about her now came by with eggs, requests, stories. A child brought her a drawing, 3 stick figures and a heart. The child said, "That's you and Mr. Ward and the cat." They didn't own a cat, but Clara smiled anyway and pinned the picture to the pantry wall. One Sunday afternoon, she walked to the post office on her own, cane tapping softly against the boardwalk. The man behind the counter looked surprised when she asked for paper and a pen. He handed them over without a word. She returned home, sat at the table, and wrote a letter. She didn't write to the man who had once rejected her. She didn't write to her old city, or even to her mother, who had died long before Clara ever boarded that train. She wrote to the version of herself who once stood on a foggy platform with nothing but a crutch and a crushed letter in hand. She wrote to remind that girl she had made it. Later that evening, Elias found her asleep on the porch swing, the unfinished letter folded neatly on her lap. He didn't wake her, just lifted her gently, carried her inside, and covered her with the quilt she'd sewn from scraps, every patch a different chapter of her journey. One night, as frost returned to the windows and the fire crackled low, he asked her if she ever thought about leaving. "Leaving where?" she asked, puzzled. "This place. This life." She touched his hand. "Why would I run from where I was finally seen?" He kissed her forehead. "You saved me," he whispered. "No," she said. "We recognized each other in the ruin. That's different." Winter came heavy. The sky turned silver. Her limp worsened in the cold, but Elias never let her struggle alone. When it snowed, he cleared the path before she even asked. When her hands ached, he tied her apron gently. When she couldn't reach something, he brought it down without fuss. He didn't love her despite anything. He simply loved her. And one evening, sitting beside her with his calloused hand resting over hers, he told her what he had never told another soul. "I lost a child. Years ago. Before the war. She was only 4. Clara's breath caught. "No one asks about her," he said, his voice brittle. "No one remembers." "I will," Clara whispered. He wept then, for the first time she'd ever seen. Not loudly, just quietly, with his face buried in her shoulder. She held him through it, her hand tracing small circles over his back. She didn't need him to be strong every moment. She only needed him to be real. And when he looked at her again, eyes red, heart open, she knew they had stepped into something sacred. Not romance, not even love. Something deeper. Recognition. restoration, refuge. Time passed. They planted a garden. She taught him how to braid bread. He taught her how to sharpen tools. They fought once, over nothing and everything. She cried. He left. Then returned before sunset, holding 2 apples and no excuses. They apologized in the way people do when they know words are only part of healing, through actions, gestures, time spent sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dark. She grew softer in the places she had once armored. He grew louder in the places he had once sealed shut. One spring morning, he came home with paint. She asked why. "I'm building you a bakery. Just a little one." She didn't know what to say. He smiled. "You don't have to earn your place anymore. You've already built it." Later that year, the town gathered for another festival. This time, it was Clara who brought the bread. It was Elias who carried the tablecloth, and the 2 of them who danced first when the music began. She still limped. But now, no one saw it as a flaw. Not because she changed, but because they had. And now, dear listener, if you've made it this far, hear this. If the world ever called you too broken, too crooked, too difficult to love, remember Clara May Jenkins. She came west with a limp and a letter. She left the train with nothing but her name and a basket of bread. And still, she carved a place in the world with quiet dignity and unshakable grace. So when someone tries to make you smaller, when they look at your limp, your grief, your scars, and call them burdens, remember, you do not need to be fixed to be chosen. You only need to be seen. And if you ever forget what you're worth, lean a little. Someone out there is strong enough to hold you.